Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm Devyani Chaturvedi, Research Analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode. On 5th August 2025, India became the target of Trump's tariff policies, with President Trump declaring a 25% tariff rate. This tariff rate came as a shock, as for months Indian trade officials had been negotiating with the Trump administration and were almost close to finalizing a deal. In response to Trump's harsh claims and actions, the Indian government has held its ground, especially when it comes to its energy reliance on Russia, with the latter's crude oil imports. The last few days have shaken the foundations of what seemed like a very strong, solid strategic partnership between India and the US. Joining me today to discuss this further is Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead for Trade and Economics here at ISAS. Welcome, Dr. Palit.
Thank you so much for hosting me, Devyani.
So as the world shakes, we are going to begin our conversation for today. How does this tariff spat reflect the deeper asymmetries or tensions in global trade and the global order? Are they reflective of just US-India relations, or are they part of a bigger trend?
Thank you, Devyani. Those are very interesting questions. Let me first try to reflect something on the big picture. Now, if we look back at the way the world trade and the global order has been organized for the last 3.5 decades, we know that it's been run by the rules of the WTO. And the WTO has been the most successful global economic framework which has been running for the last 30 years. And it runs on the principle of consensus. Much as the WTO perhaps has not been able to deliver on all aspects of its agenda and ambitions, nonetheless, it has made it very clear that when it comes to trade, countries should act on the principles of the most favored nation. They should not discriminate among partners. And the WTO also provides a credible and trustworthy platform for adjudication of disputes between trading partners. And it has also, in its inbuilt mechanism and programs, it has led to a systematic process of trade liberalization across countries while taking into consideration the sensitivities of various members and their economic circumstances. Now, this particular order actually was able to function quite well because there was no power contest in the global order as such, which would challenge the effectiveness and the rationale of this order, because we did have the United States being the global hegemon for a long period of time from the time the WTO came into play. The situation started changing from the end of the first decade of the current century, and especially after the transatlantic financial crisis, when the weakness of the Atlantic financial system was exposed. And that also was a time from when the emergence of China on the global economic scene became a very prominent factor, making it very clear that the Chinese economy was in a position to exert considerable influence on the global economy, and that influence made it capable of also deriving geoeconomic and geopolitical influence. So what we have seen over the last 10 to 12 years is the gradual escalation in US-China strategic competition. And that competition, clearly it's having a significant impact on the WTO's functioning. The US has begun feeling very disenchanted with the own framework that it had established, particularly the WTO and the way it had run globalization. And it is clearly under the distinct impression that the WTO is not delivering for it. And countries like China and maybe certain other big developing countries which have had special and differential status have been able to benefit more from the WTO. So as a result of that, we have seen the US distancing itself consciously from the WTO. China, on the other hand, while maintaining its position and talking about global unity and a global trade order, nonetheless has also made it very clear that while it stays engaged with the WTO, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to engage separately with other countries and other communities. And those are quite visible through efforts like the Belt and Road Initiative and so on and so forth. So in the middle of all this, we now find a situation where the global trade order is actually facing a significant crisis. Because even if we look at the other middle powers of the world, countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia, UK, Australia, all of them are in a way committed to the WTO in a very basic sense, but all of them simultaneously are engaging in trade and economic framework agreements outside of the WTO, which ostensibly give much more market access and much deeper commitments to cross-border trade and a variety of other issues. Coming to the second question that you asked, Devyani, on the US-India issue specifically, I think if we look back over the last 3 decades, the United States-India partnership has really grown from strength to strength. There's no second thoughts on that. If we look back at the way it was positioned in the middle of the 1990s and the turnaround it has had from there, very significant. But let me point out 2 things in this regard. One is, if you look at the history of the India and the United States signing agreements, there has been only one agreement. That's the civil nuclear deal. The 2 countries have never signed any other agreement, which is basically a reflection of the fact that, agreements are not easy to be signed between these 2 countries because they really have differences and challenges. While agreeing on a large number of issues and appreciating each other's capacities, reaching an agreement between these 2 countries is never going to be easy. And the second thing that I'd like to mention is that in this overall growth of a strategic bonhomie between the 2 countries, trade, while it expanded largely, trade has always been a tacky issue between the 2 countries. And if we take a step back, then it is not just President Trump who contributes to this, even from the time of President Obama. And historically, India and the US has had a large number of disputes filed against each other at the WTO. During the Trump administration, we saw this getting pushed to a very significant extent during the Trump 1.0, because India lost its GSP status, along with countries like Thailand and Turkey. Subsequently, when the Biden administration came in, trade didn't turn out to be a matter of tension because the Biden administration was not interested in free trade agreements. But it did work on correcting certain trade facilitation issues through what I would call are typically, tier 1.5 or tier 2 kind of frameworks, where India and the US were successful in taking off quite a few of their existing disputes from the WTO and mending market access issues on existing points. But once Biden left and the Trump agenda came on 4, India was, in many respects, perhaps people felt in a sweet spot, because India began negotiating a deal early with the US. During Trump 1.0, India and the US had come very close to signing a deal when the US presidency ended. But the fact is that while India was early and was one of the sort of first movers to engage with President Trump, and in fact it also went into a preparatory mode on the domestic side by bringing down customs duties on a variety of items in the last union budget, it was never going to be easy, because the United States demands have been very strong. And for India, there are certain red lines which are very difficult to cross. And today we come across a situation on which I'm sure we are going to discuss further. But today we come across a situation which, in the India-United States trade discourse, has taken a turn which is not easy to mend, because it stepped way beyond an economic market access based negotiating framework to a very strong geo-economic counterbalancing framework, if I can put it that way.
I think such tariffs kind of also, as you mentioned, show a deviation from not just the global trade norms but also the rule-based order which the US had developed. Now, as these tariff spats increase, I wouldn't say tariff wars or competitions of those sorts, what are the possible areas or resolutions to such tariff-driven tensions? And what role can institutions like the WTO, which have not set to be as effective in the past, tend to play in the upcoming future? Because we've already seen Brazil sort of file for dispute resolution when it comes to tariff, and now with tariff tensions rising with India, what is the likelihood of the WTO dispute resolution mechanism being used? And do you think that these mechanisms would be fair in the current environment?
Honestly, Devyani, I don't think the WTO will be able to play a meaningful role in this regard. And the reason why I don't think it will be able to is because the way the WTO members have been either voluntarily or forcibly made to engage with the United States on the question of tariffs is something which is, in principle, completely contradictory to the way the WTO has run the global trade. Secondly, because the WTO's appellate tribunal continues to remain toothless due to the non-appointment of judges, and because the United States has never really given a sanction on it, the WTO also remains partly ineffective when it comes to disputes. So symbolically, in terms of expressing their solidarity with the global framework, as you mentioned, Brazil has moved the WTO, and there might be other countries also which might move the WTO. If you recall, in 2018, when President Trump had first issued the steel and aluminium tariffs under Section 232, India was also one of the countries, along with a large number of other countries, which have moved the WTO. But that really hasn't stopped President Trump, or for that matter, other countries from resorting to unilateral trade protective measures. But if the WTO is not being able to intervene or put an end to the crisis that we currently see in global trade, then to come back to the first part of your question, how do the tariffs get to be tackled, handled, and what is the way forward from here? Now, over here, I just want to connect back to where we ended the last question and the engagement on. You see, if we look back at the way the Trump administration has rationalized all the tariffs are clearly a policy or a tool for the administration to address the American national security interests. So the tariff is not really an economic tool. The tariff is being taken as a security tool, and it is being used in what we usually describe in the geoeconomic parlance as a tool to make other trade partners of the United States adopt economic policies or behave in such a way economically that suits and aligns with the American economic security and national security objectives. Now, over here, if we look at the way different countries have engaged with the United States on tariffs, it's very difficult to say which country has got a better deal and which country hasn't, because each country has paid a unique price for agreeing to this. The American domestic market has been weaponized, used as a tool with other trade partners to trade off market access. So while they have been told to lower their own domestic market barriers for American exports and businesses, they have also, depending upon the situations, have had to go into various kinds of purchase commitments. So we have seen countries committing to buy practically everything from America, beginning from whiskey, cheese, soya beans, cereals, to Boeing planes and fighter jets, and so on and so forth. And of course, energy, principally American oil and gas. Now, all these purchase commitments have been selective. There have been other commitments like the one that Japan has made, $550 billion of investment in the United States, but no details have been announced. There is resistance, there is discomfort in a lot of economies. In fact, I do recall even the South Korean domestic audience being especially unhappy with a number of steps that the South Korean government has taken in dealing with the US. And especially if you look at it in the context of the fact that a country like South Korea or a country like Canada or a country like Mexico already has free trade agreements with the United States, for sending their goods, market access, total market access into the US. So I think what we are going to see moving forward from here is a series of unconnected, unsynchronized, random responses that various countries have got into. But there is clearly a risk in conceding to the use of tariffs the way they are being used. The reason being, if it is being used as a national security tool, then achieving national security does not end here. National security and its maintenance is a dynamic proposition. From here, there will be further demands that are going to be made. If we look at the tariffs, we have had reciprocal tariffs that are country-specific. There are Section 232 tariffs which are product-specific. And right now, there are 8 items on which Section 232 probes are going on, including critical minerals, including copper, including food. Sooner or later, those tariffs are going to become and used. So countries that have made deals cannot rest in peace because those tariffs are waiting in the pipeline and they might not have got exemptions from the existing tariffs that are already there in place. So, for example, if you look at the deal between US and UK, the UK has got an exemption from Section 232 tariffs on import of 100,000 vehicles into the US without tariffs, but not on automobile parts. On automobile parts, the tariffs remain. So we are going to see similar more tariffs come in. There's another area of tariffs which has now come in, that is on transshipment. A country like Vietnam was brought down from its announced tariffs to 20%, but it has been told that the transshipment tariffs are going to be 40% on Vietnam, ostensibly for blocking out China and to make sure that Chinese goods don't get shipped to the United States through countries from where they attract lower tariffs. So I think this is really going to be a game which is going to have many more twists and turns as we go forward. But the real concern for a large number of countries should be over the fact that what are the non-tariff demands that now comes from the United States on them, and whether they are in a position to comply with those. Because once you succumb to whatever is being considered unreasonable, there's no stopping. There's no guarantee that what has been asked once will not be asked for again.
I think you very comprehensively kind of laid out what the bigger trends are and what are different randomized responses that may happen. But narrowing down to back to India and the US, I would want to know what, according to you, sort of triggered the recent tariff tensions. Of course, the bigger picture that you've painted kind of gives us an insight into what may be the causes, but what do you think are the causes for the tensions between India and the US, especially when it comes to market access and issues like access to dairy products, imports and exports surrounding that? And how do you think both countries are justifying their tariff actions? Are these moves grounded in domestic political economy or strategic signaling?
Devyani, if we look at what might have been the American demands from India, a pretty clear idea of that is available from what President Trump has repeatedly mentioned, lower tariffs on automobiles, greater access into the Indian agricultural market, so on and so forth. Now, let us look at this in the context of the other trade agreements that India has been negotiating and also has achieved till now. If you look at an agreement like the one that India recently signed with the United Kingdom, India has actually given market access in areas where it has never given before. So, for example, if you look at the Indian government procurement market for the central government, it's been completely liberalized. If we look at compulsory licensing provisions on which India has always had a strong position in the past, again, India has liberalized considerably. Similarly, it has allowed for foreign service provisions in auditing and accounting services, and also in a large number of areas where earlier it had maintained high tariff barriers. Now, if I were an Indian negotiator, then I would have felt that these are the best offers that I can make to the United States as well. If the United States thinks that India will be opening up its defense procurement market also, I don't really think that's a very reasonable demand, because no country really opens up the defense procure market entirely to foreign competition without checks and balances and safeguards, number one. But this is something where if the matter had stayed confined, then I would have still felt that, they are moving along in a realistic market access based back and forth offer system. That hasn't been the case. There are three factors which has very significantly complicated the context of the negotiations. The first is the claim by President Trump that he brokered peace between India and Pakistan. And apparently he has claimed it 29 times. The White House has gone on record saying that over the last 6 months he has stopped a conflict each month, which makes him a front runner and an appropriate candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. India has repeatedly denied this claim, which clearly is not the best support that you get for a Nobel Prize position, right? The second is that connecting India's market access concessions to its relationship with Russia has been another very complicated gesture. And this is something where India has made it clear repeatedly in the past that buying Russian oil is a matter of economic logic and rational for it, given the very large fuel needs that the country has, and the fact that Russian oil is available at a more reasonable price than those of other countries, and the fact that India has increased its buying of American oil, and also that there was a point in time when American official people have said that India's buying of the Russian oil actually helped stabilize the global oil market, because otherwise that oil would have been offloaded and there would have been a massive crash in global oil prices. And the third factor, I think, which has really complicated matters is the President Trump vision of BRICS. Now, the BRICS is decidedly anti-American in his point of view, because the BRICS is looking at de-dollarization. The BRICS is bringing in all kinds of anti-American agenda. Now, whether the BRICS is doing that or not is a different issue. But there is one point, I think, which we cannot overlook, that the BRICS clearly now has become a much more prominent global force than in what it was in the past, perhaps because of President Trump's, urging it to actually become so. And secondly, the BRICS has now become geographically more inclusive, particularly after the entry of countries like Indonesia and from the Middle East. And the third is, the BRICS has made it very clear that the American policies are really inimical to the interests of the developing world and the global south. Now, if all these are taken into consideration, then the price that India is being asked for to pay is much, much more than simple market access concessions. And that is something which I'm very sure India will find extremely difficult to accept, because the other thing that is to be looked at here is that what is India going to get in return? If India today demands that, okay, in order to accept some of the demands that we are getting, would India be allowed full restoration of the GSP benefits in the American market? I'm very sure the answer will be a firm no. So I think it's also important to look at this, that if you're looking at the depth of commitments, what is the reciprocity and what is the equivalence?
Absolutely. And I think if we actually just lay down the costs that India is expected to pay, I think one would be with regard to energy security, of course, because of its dependence on Russia. The second would be its geopolitical and strategic imperatives when it looks at its partnerships with multilateral or minilateral groupings like the BRICS. This is a good time to also remind our listeners that we did a podcast on BRICS a couple of weeks back, and I think you sort of gave us an inkling as to how the BRICS summit and the statement that they came out with at that time might be a huge issue when it comes to India's tariff rates with the US. So I would encourage our listeners to kind of go back and listen to that podcast, because that might help us kind of understand and deconstruct what's happening now. I think So, given that the reciprocity or the results are quite skewed, how do you think this dispute could possibly undermine a rather strong relationship that the India and the US have been recently building upon, especially when it comes to the security and the geopolitical dynamics in the Indo-Pacific? I mean, just last year or last to last year, we had India and the US kind of coming together on IPEF and all kinds of ranges of issues, including the Quad. So this comes at a not so good time, and I think it raises a big question on what sort of relationship the two countries can share in the near future.
Honestly, I think, Devyani, that there are enough sensible heads around the India-US relationship who are capable of maintaining the depth and the solidity that the relationship has without falling prey to short-term rhetorics and, what you mentioned as skewed perspectives. Because let me single out these issues one by one. If we take the tariff part out of the story, there's nothing really wrong with the India-US relationship. The United States has been aware of India's necessities with respect to Russia and Russian oil for a long time. It has not allowed that to come in the way of greater strategic communication. So there's no reason why it should want to do this at this point in time. When it comes to other issues like defense purchases, collaboration in AI, working closely on semiconductors, the point to be noted is whether the United States especially would want these elements of the collaboration to be used as geoeconomic tools again, like it has been using tariffs. If it doesn't, then I don't foresee the possibility of the India-US relationship really getting damaged in a comprehensive fashion, because there's a lot of good work that has been done in sustaining the relationship. And I think the policy establishments on both sides are very clear about the fact that this needs to be maintained. And at the end of the day, I think the United States also in its own way is clear about the fact that the Indian economy is a very appealing destination for the United States. Let's not lose sight of the fact that what President Trump has never alluded to at any point in time is the India-US relationship in services. We are talking about tariffs that are only impacting manufacturing goods. There's a huge amount of India-US trade that goes on in services, including there being about more than 2,000 global capability centers in India, most of which are actually owned by Fortune 500 American companies, which are a huge source of repatriation back home, and especially for the greater depth and leverage of the US tech companies. If we look at tech companies like the Meta, I mean, the Indian market is really the market that they're looking at, the market that is making them rework their strategies, introducing specific innovations and a large number of other items. So I think he has been intelligent enough not to trouble that part of the relationship. And I think it's that plus which is going to maintain the stability of the relationship. We just need the rhetoric to cool down at some point in time, and hopefully it will happen soon.
Besides the rhetoric, and I promise this is going to be the last question for today, besides the rhetoric, what do you think are the broader economic implications of these tariffs, and what are certain particular industries that will likely see an impact of these tariffs? And although Prime Minister Narendra Modi sort of came out with a statement as well a couple of days back, encouraging people to buy domestic goods and asking the Ministry of Finance to prepare for the impact and brace it, what are certain industries that will definitely witness an impact?
I'll confine myself to the Indian instance in this regard. I think some of India's major foreign exchange earning industries like gems and jewelry, for example, are going to get impacted because the gems and jewelry actually are very big draws in the American market because of the very large Indian diaspora over there. They are one of the biggest customers of India-made and designed gems and jewelry, particularly gold jewelry. Similarly, garments are going to be another sector. So would be perhaps leather. till now, the pharmaceuticals and drugs and medicines have not come under the scope of reciprocal tariffs. But there are probes going on them. So if they stay out of tariffs, particularly the Section 232 tariffs, then the Indian pharma companies don't have any reason to worry. The other side of the story over here, Devyani, is that, there are sectors like, for example, smartphones and the Apple smartphones that we are talking about. So the Apple has been under unusual pressure from President Trump being insisted upon to push production back to the United States. So the Apple's plans of enlarging its base and capacity further in India might need to be put on hold for the time being. But the question over here is that at some stage, and I'm not sure when that stage will come, but at some stage the American consumer will start feeling the pinch. See, right now President Trump is on a reported high because if you look at the last quarter of growth in the United States, the growth has been better than what was projected. More importantly, the tariff revenues have been very robust. Well, that was again expected because till now the sort of the tariff numbers were not really brought in to the reciprocal tariffs that we have right now. So whatever diversification and changes are going to happen now, because there was a lot of urgency on part of the supply chain managers to building and bring in all the inventories before the August tariffs actually kicked in. So I think that number has got reflected. But what is important to be looked at now is that from here onward, what is the economic trajectory for the United States? So the tariffs are one way of mobilizing revenues for the government. And Mr. Trump is aware that this is going to impact the American consumer because the American consumer has been used to buying the cheapest of the best goods in the world because of low tariffs. Now, he expects that the hit taken by the American consumer will be balanced by the income tax cuts that he is going to announce through the one big beautiful bill that has been passed. But the risk over here is that this income tax cuts are going to be funded by borrowings. And the borrowings are going to really, really increase in large measure. Now, that is not a very sustainable position for the American economy. That is what a lot of economists have been talking about, that look, this is really going to put the American economy in a situation of both fiscal and monetary unsustainability. So the question over here is that when does this realization hit the American policy establishment, both the producers as well as the consumers? Because there are reports coming in that there are around 35 million American small businesses who are extremely confused and totally caught unawares by these sharp changes in tariffs, because the tariffs are changing every day. So what does the future hold for them? I think the tariff saga is going to have its casualties coming out, not just from the rest of the world, but most essentially in America over the next 6 months to 1 year. And that is when we will need to wait and see where this game goes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Palit. I think you've really provided an anchor to a rather sinking ship and asked, I think, all of us to kind of cut through the rhetoric and see and wait and watch and see what's going to happen. So thank you for sharing your insights.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for hosting me.
Absolutely, my pleasure. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates from our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter.